Welcome to Turn Pain into Power, a collection of Zen Sleep Stories designed to guide you into peaceful rest while planting seeds of transformation in your mind. Tonight, you'll journey alongside souls who have discovered life's most profound truth, that our deepest wounds often become the source of our greatest wisdom. Through ancient temples and mountain paths, through gardens reborn from ashes and rivers that teach us to flow, these stories whisper a gentle reminder that every ending carries within it the promise of a beautiful beginning. So settle into comfort, let your breathing slow and deepen, and allow these tales of resilience to carry you toward healing sleep. Your pain has purpose, your struggles have meaning, and in the quiet space between waking and dreams, transformation awaits. The Phoenix Garden. In a quiet corner of an ancient monastery, nestled between weathered stone walls and overlooking misty mountains, there lived a monk named Kenzo. For 30 years, he had tended the monastery's garden with gentle hands and a peaceful heart. The garden was his sanctuary, where rows of vegetables grew in perfect harmony, where cherry blossoms danced in spring breezes, and where the sound of flowing water from a small stream created nature's most soothing symphony. But one autumn morning, Kenzo awoke to find his beloved garden consumed by fire. Lightning had struck during the night, and the flames had devoured everything he had cultivated with such care. The vegetables were ash, the cherry trees stood like blackened skeletons against the gray sky, and the earth itself seemed scarred and lifeless. As Kenzo stood among the ruins, his heart felt heavy with grief. Other monks gathered around him, offering words of comfort, but he could barely hear them through the weight of his sorrow. This garden had been more than his work. It had been his meditation, his prayer, his way of connecting with the divine through the simple act of nurturing life. For days, Kenzo sat in silence by the burned remains, unable to eat, unable to sleep, unable to find peace in his usual practices. The abbot, a wise old man named Master Yuki, would sit beside him without speaking, simply sharing the weight of the moment through his presence. On the 7th day, as morning mist began to lift from the mountains, Master Yuki finally spoke. "Tell me, Kenzo, what do you see when you look at this burned earth?" Kenzo's voice was barely a whisper. "I see death. I see the end of everything I loved." Master Yuki nodded slowly. "And what else?" "Nothing else. Only emptiness." The old master picked up a handful of the charred soil and let it run through his fingers. "This earth has been through the fire, yes. But fire does not only destroy, it also transforms. In this soil now lives the essence of everything that grew here before. The cherry blossoms, the vegetables, the morning glory vines, they have not disappeared. They have become part of the earth itself, richer and more fertile than it was before." Over the following weeks, Master Yuki would visit Kenzo each morning, bringing not advice but presence. They would sit together in the ruined garden, watching as the first tentative signs of new growth began to emerge. Tiny green shoots pushed through the blackened earth, finding their way toward the light with remarkable determination. Kenzo began to understand that his pain was not separate from his healing. It was part of it. Each morning when he woke with the familiar ache of loss, he chose to see it differently. Instead of running from the sadness, he sat with it, breathed with it, and allowed it to teach him about the impermanent nature of all things. Slowly, he began to work the earth again. But this time, his approach was different. Where once he had planted in careful, orderly rows, now he scattered seeds more freely, trusting the earth to know how to nurture them. Where once he had tried to control every aspect of growth, now he learned to work in partnership with forces beyond his understanding. As winter gave way to spring, the garden began to flourish in ways Kenzo had never imagined. The soil, enriched by the ashes of what had been lost, produced vegetables more vibrant and abundant than ever before. New varieties of flowers sprouted, their seeds carried by wind and birds from distant places. The cherry trees, though scarred, sent up new shoots that would one day bloom more magnificently than their predecessors. Other monks began to visit the garden, drawn by its wild beauty and the sense of peace that seemed to emanate from every corner. They would ask Kenzo about his secret, about how he had created such abundance from such devastation. "There is no secret," he would tell them, his hands gently tending a new seedling. "Only acceptance. I learned to see the fire not as my enemy, but as a teacher. It showed me that nothing truly dies, everything transforms. My pain taught me to love more deeply, to hold more lightly, and to trust in the wisdom of cycles I cannot control." Visitors would often find Kenzo in the early morning hours, sitting in quiet meditation among the plants, his face serene and radiant. The garden had become more than it ever was before, not just a place of beauty, but a living testament to the power of transformation. Years passed, and the story of the Phoenix Garden, as it came to be known, spread far beyond the monastery walls. People would journey great distances to sit in its peaceful embrace and to learn from the monk who had turned his greatest loss into his most profound teaching. Kenzo grew older, his hair white as the mountain snow, his hands weathered but gentle. He never forgot the pain of that autumn morning when he lost everything he thought he loved. But he had learned to carry that pain differently, not as a burden that weighed him down, but as fertile soil from which wisdom grew. On quiet evenings, when the garden was bathed in golden sunset light and the air was sweet with the fragrance of blooming flowers, Kenzo would sit by the small stream that still flowed through the space. He would close his eyes and listen to the water's eternal song, feeling deep gratitude for the fire that had seemed to destroy his world but had actually freed him to create something far more beautiful. The garden continued to flourish, season after season, year after year, its abundance a living reminder that what appears to be an ending is often just a new beginning in disguise. And in its heart, the spirit of transformation that Kenzo had discovered continued to offer its gentle teaching to all who were willing to sit, to listen, and to learn that pain, when met with wisdom and acceptance, always has the power to bloom into something beautiful. As night falls and stars begin to appear in the vast sky above the Phoenix Garden, peace settles like morning dew on everything that grows there. The flowers close their petals in preparation for tomorrow's light, the leaves whisper ancient secrets to the evening breeze, and somewhere in the quiet darkness, new seeds are already beginning to dream of the day they will push through the earth toward the sun. In this space where loss became gain and pain became power, all beings rest in the deep knowing that every ending contains within it the promise of a new beginning, as infinite and beautiful as the turning of the seasons themselves. The weaver's thread. High in the mountains of Tibet, where the air grows thin and the sky seems close enough to touch, there lived a young weaver named Tenzin. She had learned her craft from her grandmother, Amma Pema, who had learned from her grandmother before her, in an unbroken chain of knowledge that stretched back through countless generations. Tenzin's fingers moved like dancers across the ancient wooden loom, creating tapestries of breathtaking beauty. Her work captured the essence of her homeland, the deep blues of mountain lakes, the gold of barley fields in summer, the intricate patterns that told stories of gods and demons, heroes and ordinary people finding extraordinary courage. In the village below her mountain home, people would gather to watch Tenzin work, marveling at how she could take simple threads of yak wool and silk and transform them into windows into other worlds. Her tapestries were sought after by traders from distant lands, but Tenzin rarely sold her work. For her, weaving was not a business. It was a form of prayer, a way of celebrating the interconnectedness of all life. But when Tenzin was 25, a sudden illness struck the village. It was unlike anything the local healers had seen before, and it spread quickly through the community. Tenzin's beloved grandmother was among the first to fall ill, and despite all efforts to save her, Amma Pema passed away on a cold night when the wind howled through the mountain passes like a lost spirit. The grief that followed was unlike anything Tenzin had ever experienced. It wasn't just the loss of her grandmother, it was the loss of her teacher, her anchor, her connection to generations of wisdom. For weeks after the funeral, Tenzin sat before her loom but could not bring herself to weave. Her hands, once so sure and graceful, trembled when she tried to hold the shuttle. The colors that had once seemed so vibrant now appeared dull and lifeless. The illness that had taken Amma Pema had also left its mark on Tenzin. Her left hand had been affected, leaving her fingers stiff and clumsy. The smooth, even tension she had once maintained effortlessly was now impossible to achieve. Her tapestries, when she finally forced herself to try again, came out uneven and flawed, nothing like the perfect work she had once created. Night after night, Tenzin would sit by her small window, looking out at the stars scattered across the vast mountain sky, feeling as broken as her halting attempts at weaving. She had lost not only her grandmother but her identity. Who was she if she could not weave? What was her purpose if she could no longer create beauty? One morning, as snow began to fall gently outside her window, Tenzin noticed something she had never seen before. A spider had built its web in the corner where the window frame met the wall. The web was not perfect. It had several irregular sections where the spider had had to adapt to the uneven surface of the wood. But it was still beautiful, perhaps even more beautiful because of its imperfections. Tenzin watched the spider for hours, fascinated by how it worked with the constraints of its environment rather than against them. When a strand broke, the spider didn't start over. It incorporated the broken piece into a new pattern, creating something unique and unexpected. That day, Tenzin returned to her loom with a different intention. Instead of trying to recreate the perfect tapestries of her past, she decided to work with her new limitations. Her stiff fingers could not maintain the tight, even weave she had once mastered, so she allowed the looser tension to create a different kind of texture. Where her hand cramped and forced her to pause, she learned to see these interruptions as opportunities for new patterns to emerge. The first tapestry she completed was unlike anything she had ever made. It had irregularities, unexpected gaps where the light could shine through, and a wild, organic beauty that seemed to pulse with life. When she showed it to other villagers, they were amazed. It seemed to tell a story of resilience, of finding beauty in brokenness, of transformation rather than perfection. As months passed, Tenzin's new style evolved. She began incorporating elements she had never used before, pieces of her grandmother's old tapestries, threads unraveled from worn clothing, even strands of her own hair. Each imperfection in her work became a point of strength, each limitation a doorway to creativity she had never imagined. Word of Tenzin's transformed artistry spread beyond her village. Travelers would climb the mountain paths specifically to see her work and to commission pieces that captured their own stories of loss and renewal. A merchant who had lost his sight in one eye asked for a tapestry that showed how the world looked different but still beautiful through his remaining vision. A mother whose child had been born with a twisted leg wanted a piece that celebrated the unique way her daughter moved through the world. Tenzin realized that her pain had not diminished her art, it had deepened it. The smooth perfection of her earlier work, while technically masterful, had lacked the raw honesty that now infused every thread she wove. Her damaged hand had become her teacher, forcing her to slow down, to pay attention differently, to find new ways of creating beauty. In the evenings, when her work was done, Tenzin would sit in the same chair where her grandmother used to tell stories. She would run her fingers over the tapestry she was working on, feeling the places where the weave was tight and the places where it was loose, understanding that both were necessary for the whole to hold together. She began to teach other young people in the village, but her lessons were different from those she had received. Where Amma Pema had emphasized technique and perfection, Tenzin taught her students to embrace their unique ways of seeing and creating. She would tell them that the most important thing was not to weave without mistakes, but to weave their mistakes into something meaningful. One student, a boy whose family thought he was too restless to learn any useful skill, discovered that his tendency to weave quickly and impulsively created dynamic patterns full of energy and movement. Another, a girl who had been told she was too slow and careful, found that her methodical approach allowed her to create incredibly intricate details that others missed. As the years passed, Tenzin's home became a place of pilgrimage for those seeking to understand how suffering could be transformed into beauty. She never claimed to have found all the answers, but she had learned to live the questions more gracefully. Her tapestries became more luminous with each passing season, each one a meditation on the possibility of wholeness that includes and transcends brokenness. On quiet nights, when the mountain winds sang their ancient songs through the valleys below, Tenzin would work by the light of a single butter lamp, her fingers now moving with a different kind of confidence. She had learned that mastery was not about control but about partnership, with her materials, with her limitations, with the mysterious forces that guided her hands in their dance across the loom. The tapestry she was working on now would never be finished, she knew. It had grown beyond the confines of her loom, covering most of one wall of her home, and it continued to evolve each day. It was the story of her life woven in wool and silk, in colors that shifted from dark to light and back again, in patterns that spoke of loss and discovery, of endings that became beginnings. As midnight approached and the mountains settled into deeper stillness, Tenzin would set down her shuttle and rest her hands on the work in progress. In those moments of quiet completion, she could feel the presence of her grandmother and all the weavers who had come before, their wisdom flowing through her fingers into the eternal tapestry that connected all things. The thread of pain that had once seemed like it would unravel her entire life had instead become the strongest thread in her weaving, the one that gave meaning and depth to all the others. And in learning to weave with her brokenness, Tenzin had discovered that true power comes not from perfection, but from the courage to continue creating beauty even when, especially when, our hands shake and our hearts ache with all we have loved and lost. The mountain's teaching. In the remote valleys of the Himalayas, where ancient glaciers carve their slow stories into stone and the air itself seems to hum with spiritual energy, there stood a monastery that had weathered 1,000 storms. The monks who lived there had chosen a life of simplicity, rising before dawn each day to meditate, tend their small gardens, and study the teachings that had been passed down through countless generations. Among these monks was a young man named Lobsang, whose journey to the monastery had begun in tragedy. As a child in a distant village, he had witnessed his family's home destroyed in a terrible earthquake. His parents, his younger sister, his grandparents, all had been lost in a matter of moments that seemed to stretch into eternity. Lobsang had survived by chance, pulled from the rubble by rescuers who had almost given up hope. The trauma of that day had left invisible scars that ran deeper than any physical wound. For years after arriving at the monastery as a frightened 10-year-old, Lobsang had been plagued by nightmares, sudden panics that would leave him gasping for breath, and a profound sense that the ground beneath his feet could never again be trusted. The other monks were kind and patient with him, but Lobsang felt that his damaged spirit made him unworthy of their teachings. His first teacher, an elderly monk named Rinpoche Tashi, had a different perspective. "Your pain," he would tell the young boy gently, "is not a barrier to understanding, it is a doorway. But you must learn to walk through it with awareness rather than being dragged through it by fear." For many years, Lobsang struggled to understand what this meant. His meditation sessions were often interrupted by waves of anxiety that seemed to come from nowhere. During teachings about compassion and peace, his mind would be flooded with memories of destruction and loss. He felt like a broken instrument trying to play in harmony with a perfect orchestra. When Lobsang reached his 20th year, Rinpoche Tashi announced that it was time for him to undertake the traditional 3-year retreat that would deepen his understanding of the Dharma. But instead of the comfortable cave that most monks used for their retreat, he was assigned to a remote hermitage high on the slopes of the mountain, accessible only by a treacherous path that required a full day's climbing. The hermitage was barely more than a stone hut with walls that did little to keep out the mountain winds. There was space for a small fire, a meditation cushion, and little else. Lobsang would receive supplies once each month from another monk, but otherwise he would be completely alone with his practice. and with his demons. The first months were the most difficult of his life. Without the gentle structure and community of the monastery to distract him, Lobsang was forced to confront the full intensity of his inner landscape. The silence was so complete that he could hear his own heartbeat, and in that rhythm he began to recognize the persistent undertone of fear that had colored every moment of his existence since childhood. Night after night, as wind howled around the hermitage like the voices of all the world's lost souls, Lobsang would sit in meditation and watch his mind create elaborate fantasies of disaster. Avalanches would bury the hut, earthquakes would split the mountain in half, storms would tear away the roof and leave him exposed to the elements. His body would react to these imagined catastrophes as if they were real, flooding him with adrenaline and leaving him exhausted. But gradually something began to shift. In the enforced stillness of his retreat, Lobsang started to observe his fear with the detached curiosity of a scientist studying a natural phenomenon. He noticed that the fear always followed the same pattern: first a trigger, often just a sound or a memory, then a rush of physical sensations, then an elaborate mental story about impending doom, and finally a period of exhaustion as his nervous system slowly returned to baseline. Understanding this pattern was the beginning of freedom. Lobsang realized that he had been fighting his fear as if it were an enemy, which only made it stronger. Instead, he began to greet it like an old friend whose visits, while not always welcome, could be endured with grace. In his second year of retreat, a real disaster struck. An early spring avalanche damaged the path to his hermitage, making it impossible for supplies to reach him for several weeks. Lobsang found himself facing the kind of life-threatening situation that had haunted his nightmares for years. But to his amazement, he felt calmer than he had in decades. The long hours of meditation had taught him to distinguish between real present-moment danger and the phantom threats created by his traumatized mind. The avalanche was simply a fact to be dealt with, not a symbol of cosmic malevolence. He rationed his remaining food, melted snow for water, and spent the extra time in deeper meditation, finding a peace in uncertainty that he had never imagined possible. When the path was finally cleared and contact was re-established, the monk who brought supplies found Lobsang not weak and frightened as expected, but radiant with a kind of quiet joy. His face had the weathered serenity of someone who had learned to dance with difficulty rather than merely endure it. In his third year, Lobsang's practice underwent another transformation. The fear that had been his constant companion began to reveal itself as something else entirely, a profound sensitivity to the fragility and preciousness of life. What had once felt like a curse now seemed like a gift, allowing him to feel more deeply the interconnectedness of all beings, the poignant beauty of impermanence. He began to understand that his childhood trauma, rather than making him unfit for spiritual life, had actually prepared him for insights that monks who had lived sheltered lives might take decades to achieve. His intimacy with loss had taught him not to take any moment for granted. His familiarity with fear had shown him the courage that exists on the other side of terror. When Lobsang emerged from his 3-year retreat, his fellow monks were struck by the change in him. Where once there had been a young man struggling against his own mind, Now there was someone who moved with fluid acceptance through whatever circumstances arose. His teaching style, when he eventually became a teacher himself, was unlike any they had encountered. Students who came to him carrying their own traumas found in Lobsang someone who truly understood their struggle. He never offered platitudes about transcending suffering or leaving pain behind. Instead, he taught them how to build a conscious relationship with their difficulties, how to find stability within instability, how to discover the unshakable peace that exists in the very heart of uncertainty. His most famous teaching was what became known as the cracked bell meditation. He would ring an old bell that had been damaged in an earthquake, creating a sound that was haunting and beautiful precisely because of its imperfection. Listen, he would tell his students, to how the crack in the bell doesn't ruin the sound, it makes it unique. Your wounds are not obstacles to enlightenment, they are the very places where the light gets in. Over the years, students would travel great distances to study with the monk who had learned to transform his trauma into wisdom. They would find him in the monastery's meditation hall at all hours, sitting with perfect posture but with a gentleness that spoke of someone who had learned to hold both strength and vulnerability in the same moment. Lobsang never forgot the frightened child he had once been, huddled in the ruins of his former life. But he had learned to see that child not as a burden to be healed, but as a teacher to be honored. The earthquake that had shattered his world had also cracked him open to a compassion that might otherwise have taken lifetimes to develop. In his later years, when visiting teachers would ask him about his method for working with difficult emotions, Lobsang would smile and point to the mountain that rose behind the monastery. "The mountain doesn't resist the storm," he would say. "It doesn't fight the snow or argue with the wind. It simply remains itself through all conditions. This is what our pain teaches us, not to become as hard as stone, but to find our essential nature that cannot be shaken by any external circumstance." As evening falls over the monastery and the mountain peaks catch the last light of day, Lobsang can still be found in meditation, his breathing synchronized with the eternal rhythm of the earth itself. In the silence between heartbeats, he rests in the understanding that pain and peace are not opposites but dance partners, each one teaching us to appreciate the other more fully. The young boy who lost everything in an earthquake grew up to become a man who found everything in emptiness, who discovered that the very ground of being is more solid than any foundation built by human hands. And in teaching others to find their footing in the midst of life's inevitable shakings, he transformed his deepest wound into his greatest gift. The river's wisdom. Along the banks of the Mekong River, where ancient Cambodian temples rise like prayers from the jungle floor, and the water flows with the accumulated wisdom of countless miles, there lived a fisherman named Sapi. For 3 generations, his family had made their living from the river, reading its moods like a beloved relative's expressions, knowing exactly where the fish would gather with each change of season. Sapik's boat was carved from a single piece of teak, polished smooth by decades of his father's hands and then his own. Every morning before dawn, he would push off from the muddy shore and disappear into the mist that rose from the water like the breath of sleeping spirits. His nets were woven with a skill passed down from his grandmother, each knot tied with meditative precision. But when Sapik was 32, the war came to his village. Foreign armies swept through the countryside like a destructive flood, leaving nothing unchanged in their wake. The fighting was fierce and chaotic, turning neighbors against neighbors and filling the peaceful river with the debris of a shattered world. One terrible night, as explosions lit the sky like malevolent lightning, a mortar shell struck Sapik's home. He survived, but barely. His wife and young daughter were not so fortunate. When he emerged from the ruins at daybreak, everything that had given his life meaning was gone. His boat had been destroyed, his nets burned, his family taken from him in an instant that seemed to stretch into eternity. The months that followed passed like a fever dream. Sapik wandered through refugee camps, his eyes empty of everything except the kind of pain that burns so deep it eventually numbs itself. He had lost not only his loved ones but his identity. Who was a fisherman without a boat? What was a father without a child? How does a man continue living when the very reasons for living have been torn away? For 2 years, Sapik drifted from place to place, taking whatever work he could find, sleeping wherever exhaustion finally overcame him. He avoided the river that had once been his home and his livelihood. The sight of water moving peacefully through the landscape felt like a mockery of his inner turmoil. How could the world continue its ancient rhythms when his personal universe had collapsed? It was an old monk named Venerable Bun who finally found Sapik sitting by a roadside, thin and hollow-eyed, watching traffic pass with the detached interest of someone who no longer felt connected to the human story. The monk sat down beside him without speaking, sharing the silence until Sapik finally looked up and met his kind eyes. "The river misses you," Venerable Bun said simply. Sapik's response was bitter. "The river takes everything eventually. Why should I go back to feed it more sorrow?" The old monk nodded thoughtfully. "Perhaps that is true. But have you considered that the river also gives everything back, in different forms? The water that flows past today is not the same water that flowed past yesterday, yet it is still the river. The trees that fall into its current become soil for new trees. The fish that die feed new fish. Nothing is truly lost. Everything transforms." These words planted a seed in Sapik's mind, though it would be many more months before it began to sprout. Gradually, almost against his will, he found himself drawn back toward the water. At first, he could only bear to sit on distant banks, watching the eternal flow and trying to reconcile the peace it represented with the violence he had witnessed. Slowly, memory by memory, Sapik began to allow himself to remember the good times. His daughter's laughter when she would accompany him on calm morning fishing trip. His wife's gentle hands mending nets in the evening light. The satisfaction of providing for his family through his own skill and the river's generosity. The pain was still there, sharp as ever, but it was accompanied now by gratitude for what had been. One morning, moved by an impulse he didn't fully understand, Sapik borrowed a small boat and ventured onto the water for the first time in 3 years. His hands, once so sure on the oars, were clumsy and uncertain. His body had forgotten the subtle shifts in balance required to move gracefully with the current. But as the sun rose and burned away the morning mist, something in his chest began to loosen. The river welcomed him back like an old friend who doesn't need explanations for long absences. The fish were still there, silver flashes beneath the surface. The birds still followed their ancient flyways along the water. The current still sang its eternal song of change and continuity, loss and renewal. Sapik began fishing again, but his approach was different now. Where once he had worked with the focused efficiency of a man supporting a family, now he fished with the meditative attention of someone seeking to understand deeper mysteries. Each cast of his borrowed net became a prayer. Each fish he caught a small miracle to be received with reverence. As weeks turned into months, other survivors began to seek out Sapi. Word had spread of the fisherman who had lost everything and yet returned to the water with a kind of peace that others longed to understand. They would find him in the early morning hours, moving like a ghost across the misty surface of the river, his movements fluid and purposeful. "How do you do it?" they would ask. "How do you find peace when the world has taken everything from you?" Sapik's answer was always simple but profound. "The river taught me that holding on creates suffering. When you fight against the current, you drown. When you move with it, even the strongest flood can carry you to safety. I learned to stop fighting against what happened and to start flowing with what is." He began taking other trauma survivors out on the water, teaching them the basics of fishing but also something more fundamental: how to be present with the current moment instead of being trapped in the past or fearful of the future. On the river, there was only now, only this cast of the net, only this breath, only this gentle rocking motion that seemed to rock the mind itself into stillness. One student was a woman whose husband had been killed in the same attack that destroyed Sapik's family. She came to the river carrying rage like a poison in her veins, speaking constantly of revenge and justice. Sapik listened with compassion but said little. Instead, he taught her to watch the water. See how the river flows around the rocks instead of trying to smash through them? He asked one quiet afternoon as they sat in his rebuilt boat. The rock seems stronger, but over time the water shapes the stone. This is not the power of force. It is the power of persistence, of flexibility, of accepting what cannot be changed while continuing to move forward. Gradually, the woman's anger began to transform into something else. Not forgiveness, which felt impossible, but a kind of fluid acceptance that allowed her to continue living without being consumed by hatred. She started bringing her children to the river, teaching them to fish and to find solace in the ancient rhythms of water and sky. Other students followed, each carrying their own burden of loss, each learning from the river's example of how to flow around obstacles rather than being stopped by them. Sapik's small fishing operation became an informal healing center, a place where the war's survivors could learn to navigate the aftermath of trauma with some of the river's own grace and persistence. Years passed, and Sapik's reputation as a teacher grew. But he never forgot that his wisdom had been purchased with the ultimate price. Every morning, before pushing his boat into the current, he would hold a brief ceremony of remembrance for his wife and daughter, not dwelling in the past, but honoring it as part of the flow that had brought him to this present moment. He remarried eventually, to a woman who understood that his heart was large enough to hold both old love and new love simultaneously. They had children who grew up on the river, learning to read its moods and respect its power. But Sapik's teaching remained the same, that pain is not the enemy of peace but its teacher, showing us where we need to learn to flow more skillfully. On calm evenings, when the water reflects the sky so perfectly that it's impossible to tell where one ends and the other begins, Sapik would sit in his boat and feel the presence of everyone he had lost and everyone he had found. The river had taught him that death is not the opposite of life, but part of its eternal circulation, like water evaporating into clouds only to fall again as rain, nourishing new growth. His greatest teaching was often delivered in complete silence, simply by the way he moved through the world with the fluid grace of someone who had learned to bend without breaking. Students would watch him cast his nets or navigate around fallen trees, seeing in his movements a demonstration of how to work with life's obstacles rather than against them. As night falls over the Mekong and the first stars begin to appear in its dark mirror, Sapik returns to shore with the day's catch and the day's lessons. The river continues its ancient journey toward the sea, carrying within its flow the stories of all who have touched its banks, all who have learned from its example, all who have discovered that the deepest power comes not from resisting the current but from learning to navigate it with wisdom, compassion, and an open heart. The fisherman who lost everything in the war became the teacher who helped others find everything in the simple act of flowing forward, one moment at a time, trusting that the river of life, despite all its apparent cruelties, ultimately carries us toward some deeper understanding of what it means to be fully, courageously alive. The Silent Bell. In the ancient city of Kyoto, where centuries of spiritual practice have worn smooth the stones of temple pathways and filled the air with the lingering essence of incense and prayer, there stood a temple known for its bell. This was not just any bell, but one whose tone was said to carry prayers directly to the heavens, whose deep bronze voice could calm troubled minds and heal wounded hearts. The bell's keeper was a young monk named Hiroshi, who had come to the temple as a child, seeking refuge from a world that had proven too harsh for his sensitive nature. Born with a severe stutter that made every attempt at speech a struggle, Hiroshi had endured years of mockery and isolation before finding sanctuary in the temple's peaceful embrace. For Hiroshi, the bell became his voice. Each morning at dawn and each evening at dusk, he would strike it with the ancient wooden mallet, sending waves of pure sound rolling across the city like a blessing made audible. In those moments when the bell sang, Hiroshi felt connected to something vast and wordless, something that didn't require the clumsy approximations of human speech. The other monks respected Hiroshi's dedication and the particular reverence he brought to his duties. His stutter, which had been such a source of shame in the outside world, seemed to disappear in the temple's accepting atmosphere. When he did speak during their simple conversations, his words came slowly but with careful consideration, weighted with the same mindfulness he brought to everything else in his life. But on a winter night when Hiroshi had been at the temple for 15 years, disaster struck. A fire, started by faulty electrical wiring in a nearby building, spread quickly through the old wooden structures of the temple complex. Despite the heroic efforts of firefighters and monks working together, much of the temple was destroyed, including the ancient bell tower. Hiroshi was the last to evacuate the tower, desperately trying to save his beloved bell from the flames. When the roof finally collapsed, he was trapped beneath burning timber. The other monks managed to rescue him, but not before the fire had taken a terrible toll. His hands, which had struck the bell with such loving precision for so many years, were severely burned. The doctors said he would likely never regain full use of them. Even more devastating was the loss of the bell itself. The bronze had melted in the intense heat, leaving nothing but a puddle of metal that had once sung with celestial voice. When Hiroshi learned of this, lying in his hospital bed with his hands wrapped in bandages, he fell into a despair so deep that he refused to speak at all, even the halting words that had once come with such effort. For months after returning to the partially rebuilt temple, Hiroshi sat in silence. His damaged hands could barely hold a cup of tea, let alone strike a bell with the precise touch that had been his gift. The other monks tried to comfort him, offering alternative roles in the temple community, but Hiroshi seemed to have retreated into a place beyond their reach. The head monk, an elderly man named Rashi Tanaka, watched Hiroshi's suffering with deep compassion but also with patience. He had seen many forms of spiritual crisis in his long years of teaching, and he understood that some kinds of healing could not be rushed. Instead of offering advice or assignments, he simply sat with Hiroshi in silence, sharing the weight of loss through presence alone. One morning, as spring began to soften the harsh edges of winter, Rashi Tanaka approached Hiroshi with an unusual request. A new bell had been donated by a wealthy patron, he explained, but it was raw and untrained, its voice harsh and discordant. Would Hiroshi consider listening to it, just listening, to help determine how it might be refined? Hiroshi's first instinct was to refuse. The idea of hearing another bell, knowing he could never again create the pure tones he had once coaxed from bronze, felt like a betrayal of his old friend. But something in the Rashi's patient gaze convinced him to try. When the new bell was struck, its voice was indeed rough and unpleasant, like a singer who had never learned to breathe properly. But as Hiroshi listened with the trained ear of someone who had spent years in intimate communion with bronze and resonance, he began to hear possibilities hidden within the discord. "The voice is there," he whispered to Rashi Tanaka, his first words in months. It just needs to be found." Over the following weeks, Hiroshi worked with the temple's craftsmen to adjust the bell's shape, adding small amounts of metal here, filing away tiny bits there, each modification based not on theoretical knowledge but on his deep intuitive understanding of how sound wanted to move through space. His damaged hands could not do the fine work themselves, but they could guide others with a precision born of years of listening. As the bell's voice gradually improved, something unexpected began to happen to Hiroshi as well. His focus on helping the new bell find its voice seemed to awaken something in his own spirit that had been sleeping since the fire. He began to speak more, still slowly and carefully, but with a newfound confidence that his words, like the bell's improving tone, had value even if they came imperfectly. The breakthrough came on a morning when the bell's voice had achieved a clarity that surprised everyone. As the craftsman struck it for the first time with its newly refined tone, Hiroshi felt a familiar resonance in his chest, the same feeling he had experienced years ago when he first heard his original bell sing. "Wait," he said, stepping forward with more animation than he had shown in months. He took the mallet in his scarred hands, gripping it awkwardly but with determination. The strike he delivered was not the elegant technique of his youth, but it carried something else, a depth of understanding that came from having lost everything and found it again in a different form. The sound that emerged was extraordinary. It was not the same as his old bell's voice, but it was equally beautiful in its own way, carrying within its tone all the pain and healing Hiroshi had experienced. The other monks stood in stunned silence as the bell's song rolled across the temple grounds, and many felt tears flowing unexpectedly down their faces. From that day forward, Hiroshi resumed his role as bell-keeper, but his approach was transformed. Where once he had struck the bell with technical precision, now he brought to each ring a quality of presence that seemed to infuse the sound itself with compassion. His limitations had not been overcome. His hands still shook. His speech still came with effort, but they had been integrated into a deeper mastery. Students began traveling to the temple specifically to study with the monk who had learned to make beauty from brokenness. They would find Hiroshi in the bell tower at all hours, sometimes striking the bell, sometimes simply sitting in meditation beside it, teaching through example how to find one's authentic voice even after, especially after, it has been tested by fire. His most profound teaching was what came to be known as the lesson of the cracked voice. When students would express frustration with their own limitations or imperfections, Hiroshi would invite them to listen carefully to the bell's tone. "Do you hear that slight roughness in the sound?" he would ask. "That comes from a tiny crack that appeared during the refining process. We could smooth it out, make the tone more technically perfect. But listen more deeply. Can you hear how that small imperfection gives the sound its character, its humanity? This is what I learned from the fire. Our cracks are not flaws to be hidden, they are the places where our truest voice emerges." Years passed, and Hiroshi's reputation as a teacher grew throughout Japan and beyond. But he never forgot the lesson of his original bell, the one that had been destroyed in the fire. He understood now that his attachment to that particular voice, that specific way of creating beauty, had been a form of spiritual prison. The fire had not taken away his gift. It had freed him to discover gifts he never knew he possessed. Visitors would often ask about the source of his wisdom, expecting complex philosophical explanations. But Hiroshi's answers were always simple and direct. "Pain is the great teacher," he would say, his words coming slowly but with absolute clarity. "It shows us what we can lose, but more importantly, it shows us what cannot be destroyed." The bell was lost, but the listening remained. The hands were damaged, but the heart that guides them grew stronger. This is what I learned in the silence after the fire, that our truest voice is not the one that comes easily, but the one that emerges when we have nothing left to lose. In the evenings, when the last visitors had departed and the temple settled into peaceful quiet, Hiroshi would often sit alone with his bell, not striking it but simply being present with its potential for sound. He had learned to love the silence as much as the ringing, understanding that both were necessary parts of the same cosmic rhythm. The boy who had come to the temple to escape his stutter had grown into a man who taught others that our greatest limitations often conceal our most profound gift. The monk who had lost his voice in fire had discovered that true communication happens not through perfect words or flawless technique, but through the willingness to show up authentically, cracks and all, and offer whatever broken beauty we have to give. As night deepens around the temple and the first stars appear above the ancient roof lines, the bell waits in patient silence for tomorrow's dawn, when Hiroshi will once again offer his imperfect hands in service of perfect sound. And somewhere in that space between silence and song, between damage and healing, the deepest teaching continues to unfold, that power comes not from avoiding the fire, but from learning to sing with whatever voice emerges from the flames. The silent bell-keeper who found his voice in voicelessness, who discovered strength in broken hands, who learned that the most beautiful sounds often come from the most wounded hearts. His story continues to ring out across the world, teaching all who have ears to hear that our pain, when met with courage and compassion, always has the power to become our greatest song.